Welcome to the SAS Viya Release Highlight Show, Holiday Edition 2021. I'm your host, Anna Brown, and I can't wait to get into a ton of product updates for you today. We're talking about release number 2021.2.1. Now, just a couple of them to wet your whistle include some new social media data connectors from SAS Access, outlier detection in SAS Visual Analytics, CAS action for corpus analysis in SAS Visual Text Analytics, and some model bias assessment capability in SAS Visual Data Mining and Machine Learning. Then we will get to talk about, drum roll please, a brand new product, SAS Workload Management. Our friend Mark Schneider, Advisory Product Manager, will tell us all about SAS Workload Management and how it can simplify your analytic workloads in SAS Viya. Now, before we get to all that, a couple of reminders. We want you to join us here on the show today. Give us your insight, your feedback, your questions on the chat and on YouTube, or if you're watching on LinkedIn, in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. I'll start. I'll give you a question. What is your critical #1 data source you connect to? Would love to hear your input. All right, now the moment you've been waiting for, I introduce the rundown.
We've got some great new data sources being added to the platform this month through C data drivers accessible through SAS Access to JDBC and the data connectors. You can now access data from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube Analytics, Google Analytics, as well as data stored in Google Drive and OneDrive, and OData for those favorite RESTful services. So let's take a brief look through some of those new drivers. So Twitter, that's great. We all use Twitter, but we can now easily pull that information in, perhaps do some text mining, for example, or if we just want to some simple things, we could perhaps just create some pie charts looking at where that data is coming from. And here we can see the data and split there. Jumping into Google Drive, we can, for example, pull in Google Drive here. So if we go into the drive, we can see we've got a number of files stored there, perhaps been shared with us, and we want to pull them into the platform. Again, simple libname statement. Setting up the JDBC connections, we can get information from the C data documents in terms of how we set all of that up. Very straightforward. And we can then just run some files against it, see what files we've got in there, and then we can go through, execute. For example, we can create new folders, we can upload and download files, and we can use those to create some work. So for example, here I had some data looking at happiness. I've been able to pull it out of Google Drive and create some charts looking at the happiest countries in terms of the rankings of those, and how does that relate to the capita per capita income and GDP there. And finally, just as an example, OData, if you look for OData, you will see lots of different services. Here we're using a couple of different ones. Here this is looking at a kind of ERP type system with orders, for example, just running the libname and then running some fed SQL at the end of this. And we can pull out the number of orders, for example, run against things. All very straightforward, and we'll see those results coming up in just a moment. And a second example here is where we can pull data from sort of the different parliaments. So in this case, pulling data from the UK Parliament and looking at some particular electorate numbers in terms of majorities, etc. So as I say, 7 new drivers in there. Have a great time working with those, and I'll speak to you soon.
In this month's highlight, I'm going to share updates to outlier detection capabilities in SAS Visual Analytics. I'm going to start by adding some data items to my report to build a visualization, and when I do so, I notice this icon appear on the banner indicating that insights were found. I simply click on that icon and I'm shown that outliers have been detected in my data for the data items cylinders and MSRP. To learn more, simply click the information icon and I'm told that there are 5 outlier values in cylinders. I can view those outliers to do deeper analysis to better understand how the outliers are impacting my report. And I'm presented with a natural language explanation telling me that the outliers that have been identified don't change the overall sum, average, or median by more than 5%. I can look at the heat box or the heat plot and see that the majority of my statistical information about my data for cylinders, as well as I can see the outliers where cylinders equals 10 and cylinders equals 12. The next visualization in this popover is the detailed list of the identified outliers. Here you see the cylinders of 12, followed by columns that are the highest related factors to determine the cylinders. So we can look through these columns of information to better understand why these detailed items might be outliers. We can also investigate this third visualization that shows us the impact of outliers on our aggregations of sum, average, and median. We see including the outliers, what the values are, excluding the outliers, followed by the percent difference and the difference. And we see that, yes, indeed, these are all below 5%, so they meet the threshold of not really being a severe impact. If we look at MSRP to understand outliers detected in the MSRP data item, we see that there have been 27 outliers detected. And if we perform deeper analysis on that, we'll see that these values, the outlier values, have been binned. So there are 20 in this category or in this range, 3 in this range, and 3 in this range, as well as the standard statistical information that we provide through our heat box visualization. Looking through the detailed outliers, we see that the highest outlier is 192,000. And we scroll down through our other outliers, and we see that the smallest outlier is 68,995. Also, these columns, like I said earlier, are the highest related factors that determine MSRP. We see in the natural language explanation, these outliers, they change the overall sum and average by more than 5%. So let's investigate that a bit. Here we see that the MSRP, including outliers for sum, average, and median, excluding the outlier impact. So here we see that there's almost a 17% impact in the sum of MSRPs due to the outliers. The average has been impacted by 11.39, and we can see the absolute difference provided as well. So some really good information to help us understand the impact that outliers may be having on our exploration.
One new feature is Egeria integration. In this case, I'm looking at a library public and looking at the cataloged tables. In this case, there's a bank customer table that's part of the public library. You can see that the table has been cataloged into SAS Information Governance. Once the table is cataloged, and if the Egeria integration setup is already established, user can now move to the Egeria UI and be able to search for the asset that was cataloged in SAS Information Governance and be able to find in the Egeria. Here I'm looking at the public library that we had as a discovery agent in SAS Information Governance. You can also see the path and what is the properties that was originally established while the data was created, when the data was created in Egeria as part of the catalog. Here we're looking at the table that's part of the public library. Looking at the table information in Egeria, you can see the properties has pretty much most of the profile information that we had in the information governance, and the table name, and what type of entity, asset in this case, this object is. I can also search and find columns that's part of the table. Let's look at one column, that job classification. You can also look at the information privacy, whether the data is private. These are some of the properties that's carried over from information governance into Egeria. Users can add, or customers can add their own custom properties when they create an object in Egeria. I'm looking at the job classification column that's part of the table, the bank customer. So relational column, entity type in Egeria. And these are some of the properties that's part of the job classification. Now, users can, this is a Juya being open source, the user can, or customers can rather use all the APIs that's available as part of this application in the Jupyter notebook, and can execute and call the APIs to either create a relationship or add an asset and create relationship between the SAS asset and any third-party asset that's existing out there.
Our big spotlight feature this month is the inclusion of a report on the fairness of models by assessing them for bias against groups in specified sensitive attributes. Now, this is obviously really important because these models are used to make decisions, and we need to ensure that we don't perpetuate existing bias that the data may represent, or perhaps introduce new bias into those decisions. So by automatically assessing these models for different groups from a performance and prediction standpoint, you get an immediate sense of the fairness. And if there's an indication of disparity here, it's at least a warning sign that you should reconsider the data used and your modeling process overall.
Hey everyone, it's Gunja here. I'm very excited to introduce to you a very helpful feature that is coming up in the latest release 2021.1.6 of SAS Econometrics. Proc CSSM's new scoring capability provides great advantages when you analyze data generated in a sequential fashion, such as time series or longitudinal data. With this scoring capability of Proc CSSM, you can easily perform forecasting and scenario analysis or perform stability monitoring of an ongoing data stream. To do scenario analysis, you first specify and fit your state space model and create a score store by using the score statement and the out equals option, which specifies the data table where the necessary context information is saved. Next, you create a data table for each of your different future predictor scenarios. Finally, by using these data tables as your input data set, you forecast the response series based on the model that you learn for each scenario. This time, you use the in equals option in the score statement and output the scored rows using the output statement. And voila! You can merge these output data tables and obtain a table like this with your forecast values for different scenarios. Stability monitoring of an ongoing data stream is another advantage that Proc CSSM's scoring capability offers. Stability monitoring helps you to flag unexpected changes in the normal behavior of the process as soon as possible. To perform stability monitoring, the score store must be updated on a continual basis to incorporate the information from the incoming data. You can easily do this by using both the in equals and out equals options at the same time in the score statement like this. With the saved information in the score store, the model specification or the historical data are no longer needed.
Hi everyone, I'm super excited to tell you about a brand new feature we have in Visual Text Analytics for corpus analysis. Corpus analysis lets us know a little bit more about our document collection before we engage in downstream analysis. It's a brand new CAS action called Text Profile. The Profile Text action profiles text data to generate descriptive statistics that are relevant for understanding our text data. It informs model building, testing, and use on specific data sets. The action can characterize a data set, identify differences between data sets, identify errors or noise, and compare a data set to a reference data set. Let's take a quick look. On the left-hand side, you'll see my data. You may recognize the first few lines of text here. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It comes from A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. I decided it'd be kind of a fun example to take a look at some Dickens data because literary rumors state that Charles Dickens may have been paid by the word. And if you look at the results of the corpus analysis, you won't be disappointed. There's some very long sentences in this data. So what we end up doing is we call our CAS action, profile text. We set up the table, and then we specify the language and an output table. We're going to take a quick look at the output table to see what the results look like. So we have our corpus name, total number of sentences. So I analyzed the first 6 paragraphs of A Tale of Two Cities, and in those 6 paragraphs, there were only 19 sentences, which seemed a little bit mind-blowing to me. but it was Dickens. The average number of sentences per document was 1, and I set it up that way, so that wasn't a surprise. And same thing with the maximum number of sentences per document. The average tokens per sentence, let me scroll over here. Average tokens per sentence was 59. That's a lot of tokens in a sentence. The maximum number, and like I said, Dickens did not disappoint, the maximum tokens per sentence was 252. So there was one sentence in this collection of documents that had 252 tokens. That's a little mind-blowing to me. In my days, we called that a run-on sentence, but I'm not here to criticize. The total number of tokens in the 6 paragraphs was 1,121. I'm going to scroll a little bit further for us. The average token length was 4.25. The maximum token length was 18. The number of total forms, and this is total unique tokens, was 488. The number of forms that comprise 80% of the data, so number of unique forms that make up 80% of the data, was 264. If we scroll a little further to the right, we can see things like the percentages breakdown. So we have the percent of content tokens, so the actual content thing, words, like words, and that came in at around 40%. The number of stop tokens, so members of our stop list, was around 50%. The corpus analysis can also return numeric tokens, information about the number of numeric tokens in a document. In this data, we didn't have any. And then we also have the percentage of punctuation tokens, which was around 11%. So that's an overall breakdown from a corpus analysis standpoint of the first 6 paragraphs of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And there's a lot more to come on this particular feature. So this is only the beginning. So we're very excited to present it to you, and we hope you're as excited about it as we are.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to discuss an important new feature in SAS Intelligent Decisioning on the Viya release 2021.2.1. This is designed to simplify the creation of variables and mapping within your decision flows. The new feature, Custom Context for DS2, gives developers the flexibility to create and map these variables using code files written in DS2 and referenced in rule sets. The first place to start is looking at setting the custom context for the decision flow. Within the decision flow, I can use that custom context code file, in this case called routing context, and it does a couple of important things. One, the code is designed for first step around initialization. So for each inbound transaction, in this case the account routing detail, I can set reusable variable values for each of those inbound transactions. The second thing it does is it returns the actual routing table. In this case, I'm creating a set of routes that are going to be used within my decision flow. In this case also, I'm creating a data grid based on those values, and it returns that route table, and that can be referenced in rule sets within the flow. The first step to take advantage of this custom context is to look at the initialization that's done. This is referencing that init routing within the custom context and uses that inbound account routing detail to set those values on the inbound side. That's the first thing you have to do. The second thing is the reference in the rule sets, because I want to be able to return those values to use in my business logic. In this case, if I explore that build routes rule set, you can see that I'm calling the get route table that was seen back in the custom context DS2 code file. Back now in the decision flow, another important feature is you'll see that for the mappings for each of these are overly now simplified. There's no more manual variable mapping required. The mapping on the inbound side is those input from that inbound transaction, but no output is needed. And on the build routes rule set, the only mapping that's needed is to be able to map to the outbound side for that route table that was created in my custom context in the DS2 code file. That simplifies the mapping across this, making it easier for developers to reference those variables.
Thank you, team, for all of those updates. Wow, you have been busy toward the end of 2021. Lot that we went through there, and I'm sure our viewers are just digesting it little by little. By the way, welcome to the show, Mary Osborne. So great to hear from you about visual text analytics and that CAS action for corpus analysis. Particularly liked the Dickens example. Everyone, tell us in the chat, what is your favorite Dickens novel? Just for fun. My favorite is A Christmas Carol, which is, of course, super appropriate this time of year. And a fun fact is that I grew up doing children's theater, and I was in the Christmas Carol play, and I was Kathy Cratchit. So there you go. All right. Listen, if you're enjoying the show, if this information is useful to you, please smash that like button and share it with a friend. We would love for you to share the SAS Viya love. Okay, now we get to see some details about SAS workload management in the release talk. Here I am joined by our friend Mark Snyder, Advisory Product Manager for SAS, to tell us all about SAS workload management. Mark, hi, what are you going to show us today?
Hey Anna, it's great to be here. Yeah, I'm really excited. One of my favorite things to do as a product manager is to release a brand new product. And I have had the blessing of being able to release two new products over the last few months. First was SAS Analytics Pro for Viya, and today we're talking about SAS Workload Management for Viya. Now, if you are an administrator and you're managing a fairly large environment with lots of different users submitting jobs all the time, interactive and batch, and you're trying to manage this workload to make the most efficient use of your resources, then SAS Workload Management is the product for you. But, better than me talking, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So how about I give you a quick demo of workload management?
I love it.
So this is SAS Environment Manager, which is the utility that a SAS administrator uses to do things like security, to monitor their environment, to watch their servers. And what workload management has done is it's introduced a new feature within Environment Manager, and it is Workload Orchestrator. Now, I like to think of Workload Orchestrator as the brains behind the workload management offering. So I use Workload Orchestrator to configure my environment. And workload management is all about distributing jobs amongst queues and sending those jobs to different hosts. So when I look at the dashboard within Workload Orchestrator, yeah, I get some information, general information about how old my image is, etc. But the real important stuff is on the right side. It's the definition of the different queues and the definition of the virtual machines or hosts within my Kubernetes cluster to which jobs are going to be sent. Now I have chosen to configure a few different queues. A default queue for batch jobs to be submitted by most folks, a priority queue for my favorite folks to submit so they have a higher SLA, they're going to get quicker response time, and then an interactive queue. The interactive queue is for my SAS Studio users. These are my data scientists who are using an interactive web application. They're doing programming and they expect immediate response, right? And so they're going to get the highest priority, certainly priority over my batch queues. Now the queues themselves, like I said, as jobs are submitted to them, then workload management figures out which hosts it divvies those out to. And the way I've configured my environment is these two batch queues, the default and the priority batch queues, will divvy out their jobs to these three hosts. The interactive queue itself, I said, well, this is so special. I want it to go to this fourth host, and I don't even want it to interact with the batch jobs. I could have chosen to overlap them. That's a personal administrator's choice. Let me show you a little bit about the configuration of those queues and hosts so you get a better feel for what I did behind the scenes. So I'm over in the configuration tab within Workload Orchestrator, and the general information allows me to set up, there are a whole bunch of properties, and I won't bore you with all of this, Anna, but I will show you that there are things like host update. Okay, now this is a setting that says, okay, every 5 seconds, all those hosts that are in my environment are going to report back to Workload Orchestrator, letting them know, okay, how are my jobs doing? How much memory am I using? How much IO is available, etc. Just so we keep the brain informed so it makes the right decisions. The other important property I wanted to highlight is this administrators property. The administrators are the folks who have the capability or the privilege to modify this workload orchestrator environment. I just don't want my standard user going in and modifying priorities so they get the highest priority, right? So we keep administrators by default. We use SAS Administrators Group as the logical group of folks who can control Workload Orchestrator. But I could assign that to my best bud if I so chose to do so. So now I go back to the dashboard, and this is great. I've shown you how I configure it, but let's actually submit some jobs, okay? Once I submit the jobs, we're actually going to see some prioritization, like I said, moving from the queues to the hosts. And sorry, going back to the configuration, those hosts themselves are identified by a host type. They either have a type of default, and for me, a default host type is those hosts that I've set up to submit batch jobs to, or the SAS Studio host type, those jobs, for interactive SAS Studio sessions. If I look at the default host type, I see those 3 hosts that were back on my dashboard. Now I can specify those hosts explicitly, or I can specify them by a Kubernetes specific label. If you're familiar with Kubernetes, you know that it can spin up hosts dynamically, and by no means do I have static names for those hosts. And so I want to use labeling in order to identify, oh yeah, this type of host that Kubernetes spins up is a candidate for these types of jobs. So that's what I'm doing, is creating candidates, which are essentially host types, which are going to receive the batch jobs in this case from my default host type. Now I can limit the number of jobs that get submitted to any individual host, and I've done so by saying no more than 4 jobs on any particular host. So those are the hosts. Now we go to the queues, right? Now the queues are, this is kind of my entry point for my users, right? When I'm submitting a batch job, I connect to a specific queue. When I'm running SAS Studio, I connect to a specific queue. So in a batch jobs case, I'm either going to be connecting to the default queue or the priority queue. Let's look at this priority queue. Now I could do a lot of things within this queue, and here's really where the advantages come in play when it comes to workload management. For example, I could set up different parameters based on different times of the day. I might have, for example, the need to set up a queue that has a high priority in the middle of the day, but then a lower priority overnight. And I could do so by scheduling different sets of parameters for different time intervals. But we've only got one time interval for my demo, and I've set the priority as 20 for this particular priority queue. Lots of other great parameters though for this. I could set it up to be the default queue, so if a user submits a job and they don't specify a queue, this is where it's going to go by default. I could also set it up, this is really interesting, to be able to restart jobs. Now, what's going to happen is, in my situation where I've got a priority queue and a default queue, if I have a whole bunch of priority jobs that get submitted, what they're going to do is they're actually going to preempt the default jobs if I run out of space on the hosts that are actually fielding those jobs. And so if I mark a particular queue as restartable, that basically means, hey, if anybody preempted my jobs, I want those jobs to automatically restart when I have availability on the hosts. So that's a really great way of keeping your jobs moving through the queues, but also taking the most efficient advantage of the resources on your hosts. I can also set things like, hey, the maximum number of jobs any particular user can specify. I could specify things like which users have the ability to submit to the job. So I'm looking at the priority queue right here, and I might not want to have all users be able to submit to the priority queue. Well, this is the way I lock them down to say, okay, only my friends, can submit to the priority queue. I have other things here. Obviously, I need to map a queue to host types. So when we were talking about those collections of hosts before, I have to actually say, okay, now this queue is able to submit jobs to this host type or these multiple host types. That's the way I map queues to host types. And then finally, I do have this preemption flag, which basically says, oh, well, this is a priority queue. So if I run out of room, I can go ahead and preempt any job on the default queue in order to make room for my priority jobs. All right, so that's enough of the configuration. Now let's run some jobs. So what I've done is I've created a script which is actually going to submit a ton of different SAS programs, right? And all I'm trying to do is create workload in my workload management environment. So I'm going to submit all these to SAS Viya. So what's going on behind the scenes is there are a whole bunch of batch jobs that I'm submitting simultaneously to both the default queue and the priority queue. You know, some of the jobs are coming in from one user and they're going to the default queue. Some of the jobs are coming in from other users and they're going to the priority queue. And so we're going to start to see these numbers change, which becomes interesting. So I see, oh, I've got 2 jobs running on the default queue. If I hit the refresh button, I'll start to see, oh yeah, I've got more jobs that are coming in. Now, if you remember, I actually put a maximum number of jobs on the host type for these 3 hosts, which said no more than 4 jobs are allowed on any one of these hosts. So that means I get a maximum of 12 jobs to be running at any one time. So we're actually going to see that here in the dashboard. You see you have 4 on the default queue, 8 on the priority queue, and 2 are pending in the default queue. And they're just going to wait there until there's a free slot. Now let me keep hitting refresh. And what you're actually going to see, very interesting, is now I've got 12 jobs running in the priority queue, 3, now 4 that are pending in the priority queue, nothing's running in the default queue. And that's because these priority jobs preempted the jobs over on the default queue. Everything's going into a pending state on the default queue right now. If I look over here in Workload Orchestrator, I actually can see this activity in a number of different ways. I can look, for example, at a quick summary of my hosts. So I see that, oh yeah, maximum jobs allowed on each host is 4, and the maximum jobs that are running, we've maxed them out. I can look at the queues themselves, and I'll see my default priority and interactive queues, and I see how many jobs are pending, right? And I can see the relative priority of those queues. Higher number means higher priority, and obviously we're running in the higher priority batch queue. Remember, this is that interactive queue that's going to a separate host fielding my SAS Studio jobs, so it's not participating in all these batch jobs. And speaking of jobs, well, I got a whole bunch of jobs running, and this jobs list shows me information, detailed information about the different jobs that are running, shows me jobs that have completed, and there are lots of different ways that I can slice and dice this data. I'll actually take a look really quickly at the ways that these jobs have finished. And if we look somewhere in here, here are some jobs. Here's an example of jobs that were actually preempted, right? They were sitting in the default queue, and too many high priority jobs came in for the priority queue, so they got preempted in order for the priority jobs to take place. All right, hopefully that all makes sense, Anna.
No, I'm good. It makes sense. I have a question on that interface you showed where the default and priority queues automatically updated and met the 12 jobs you stated was the max. I noticed that the interactive queue was not updating. How do you make that update in the same fashion?
And I'll actually show you an example of that. So what I'll do, first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kill that script because it's just going to continue to run a whole bunch of jobs, and we've got plenty of workload going on right now. So we'll get back to Environment Manager. And what I'll show you then, Anna, is the interactive queue is showing 1 job running. That 1 job running is for this one SAS Studio session that I have connected. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another SAS Studio session. I'll go ahead and log in like I'm another user, and that'll bring up SAS Studio. In fact, let's go ahead and bring up a third SAS Studio session. All right, so I've got 2 SAS Studio sessions coming up, and my initial SAS Studio session, which was running. And what we'll see if I refresh, what I'm doing up here, the upper right-hand corner is basically forcing a refresh of my dashboard so that I can get my numbers updated more frequently than the default, which is about every 30 seconds Environment Manager refreshes its information. So we'll see a lot of activity here is still going on with the batch queues, right? I've still got a bunch of priority jobs that are pending, and so they're dominating what's being distributed to those workers. But this interactive queue will eventually show 3 jobs running. And that reflects those 3 SAS Studio sessions. Now, there was a lag there. If you noticed, it showed just the one job running for a while, even though I started up those SAS Studio sessions. That lag represents the infrastructure spinning up those dynamic servers in order to field the SAS Studio sessions. And once they're spun up and ready for the programmer to actually submit code, then it would reflect as a job running truly in the interactive queue. And obviously, if we let this continue to run, for a good period of time, we would see all of these jobs pending turn to 0, and all these default jobs would eventually find slots on the workers, and these batch hosts then would truly become idle once all the jobs completed. In a real production environment, you typically have your hosts utilized as much as possible, right? That's the point of workload management, is make the most efficient use of the resources that I have at my disposal. And this becomes that much more important in the cloud because I'm trying to make my cloud costs go down. So that's basic survey of the landscape within SAS Environment Manager. Gives you kind of a taste for the look and feel and the UI, which is production today.
Wow. Thank you for taking us through that flow, Mark. That was so super interesting to see how you're taking this product to really make the most use out of your analytic resources. So tell me, what was some specific feedback you were getting from customers that inspired the team to build out workload management?
There are a couple key things that drove it, right? We have a bunch of existing customers who are using SAS Grid Manager, and they're also really enthusiastic about moving to SAS Viya. But up until now, we didn't have a good course for them. There was this big obstacle. It's, they've come to grow and to know and love all that great Grid Manager capability, but they can't afford to leave that behind and move to Viya. So huge motivation for us to get that functionality integrated within the SAS Viya infrastructure. So key driver there. And then the other thing, which I mentioned at the tail end of the demo, was the cost association with public cloud. Because we all know SAS Viya, first and foremost, designed and architected for the cloud, being truly cloud native. But as you move to the cloud, you recognize very quickly that it's not free. And so people are trying to make the most use of their cloud resources while keeping their infrastructure cloud budget down as much as possible. And workload management's efficiency and economies of scale allows me to keep that cloud cost down while at the same time meeting my performance SLAs for all the jobs that are being submitted to it.
Got it. And tell me a little bit about what life was like in SAS Viya before you had something like SAS Workload Management.
Okay, well, it wasn't as pretty, especially for those large organizations with lots of jobs, right? But there were still avenues without workload management that a lot of administrators did within Viya in order to handle that workload. So you could submit a lot of batch jobs. You could have thousands of users submitting, batch jobs to a Viya environment. And Kubernetes itself, the infrastructure that supports SAS Viya, allows for that distribution of labor across multiple nodes. And that's great. That works really well. Kubernetes also supplies high availability to make sure that, different components of the Viya infrastructure are always up and running. But when things started to fall on their face was when you started to add advanced features like queuing and prioritization, like I showed, in the demo. For example, if you were submitting a bunch of jobs and you didn't have a queue within SAS Viya, Kubernetes, when it runs out of resources, it starts tossing jobs and not running them at all. And that's not a really good prospect for users, to get no response or, no ends to any of their jobs. So those were things life before workload management. No control over queuing or prioritization, no setting job limits or user limits. I've lost a lot of control. And so workload management gives me that control. And not just me there being actually a SAS administrator. Because prior to workload management, all those knobs and controls were done by a Kubernetes administrator. And that's usually somebody who's a lot closer to IT and not as much focused on the SAS side of the fence. But what we've done is we have enabled SAS administrators to be a little bit more facile in controlling their environment.
I'm sure that our SaaS users and customers will be really happy to hear they're going to have more control over that, just on hand. So SAS workload management is to SAS Via, as SAS Grid Manager is to SAS 9. Can you tell me a little bit about the similarities and differences between those two products?
I can, and well put. That's a good analogy, Anna. First and foremost, people who are familiar with SAS Grid Manager are going to be very comfortable with the concepts that are presented by workload management, right? If I know SAS Grid Manager, I know about queuing, I know about prioritization, I know about setting limits. All these things are familiar. And if I'm using SAS Grid Manager rather than the SAS Grid Manager for platform offering, because there are two different offerings in SAS 9, I'm actually also already familiar with the user interface, the SAS workload orchestrator brain behind workload management. And so I have a lot of similarities between the two offerings that allow that easier bridge. But we didn't stop there, right? There's a lot of advantage to workload management, which we couldn't accomplish in the SAS 9 world. Things like when you're talking about the cloud and the ability to dynamically scale out, to add nodes to my environment. And the cloud, it's really simple to spin up virtual resources at a moment's notice. And so workload management allows me that capability to expand my capacity dynamically. Nobody experiences downtime from a reconfiguration perspective, and yet, I can handle greater amounts of workloads. We also don't have dependencies on third-party schedulers, so we're not introducing external software into the mix. SAS is rolling it all themselves when it comes to scheduling and doing the workload management. And then we provide a single pane of glass for administrators who are monitoring their environment. So not just seeing the jobs, and the users that are logged into my system, but all the different other components of Via, being able to see that all through a single pane of glass, that being, for example, using the Grafana utility in order to do monitoring there. But finally, the last point, and probably the most important point from a differentiation perspective, is Via itself, right? Workload management is a Via native product, and that means all of my users can now take advantage of that Via capability, bringing to the table CAS analytics, the deep learning that it has to offer, high availability of all the components, additional open source integration, etc. So there's a lot of value that comes, being a Via native product.
Certainly, I can see that, and I'm sure everybody else can too. So one question that came in on the chat was a concern about what if the host fails? What do you do in that situation?
Yeah, it's important. It happens. We all know things go bump in the night, nodes come down, etc. The good thing about workload management is it has built into it a restart capability, and so jobs that get interrupted, either intentionally because they've been prioritized out or preempted, or accidentally, have the ability to restart. And if a node comes down, a node can come back up. Kubernetes actually offers the facility to monitor the nodes and automatically bring up additional nodes in their place. But the beauty of workload management and it's the architecture behind it, it's predicated on dynamic allocation of resources to meet the workloads. And that gives us a lot of flexibility when it comes to elasticity in the environment and the capacity that it can handle, as well as that availability when invariably those nodes fail and you have to replace them with other nodes.
Very good. Very good to hear. Wow. Well, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to show us around workload management. I'm sure our customers are going to only want to dig in more. Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure. It was a great time, Anna. Thank you for having me.
Sure. All right. Well, we just covered a few of the latest and greatest release updates in SAS Viya 2021.2.1. I encourage you to check out the links in the description. You can dig into the doc, tons of learning resources to get more details. Join us on the SAS support communities and learn more about Viya there and ask your Viya questions with fellow practitioners. And while you're there, smash that like button and share this show with a friend if you find it useful to bring them in the fold on what the latest is on SAS Viya. Okay, I wish everyone a wonderful holiday. And guess what? We'll be back at you next year in January. The best way to find out about when that show will take place is to subscribe to the SAS Users YouTube channel. In the meantime, have a great holiday season and Happy New Year. Bye.